Exactly. It's the front row where we all get on.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I might just keep those in.
Where the swamps are.
All right, we might get underway. Thanks for coming along to our delayed May presentation night, and it's fantastic that we've got Peter Parker VK3YE here, who's down visiting family. Yes, so and goes back tomorrow. So we've just managed to squeeze in a presentation. Peter's going to take us through. I'm sure there'll be more than 6 winning ways of making contacts on HF. So, without further ado, over to Peter.
Okay, thanks, Justin. And yeah, all right. Well, you sometimes hear people complain about band conditions, how they aren't what they used to be. They are picking up a bit, but there's still a few people whinge about that. Some people say, oh well, the only thing that you get is FT8. You tune across other frequencies and you don't hear anyone talking. It's just all FT8, just a few beeps on 20 metres or whatever. And then there's some people that haven't had contacts on HF, even though they've got an amateur licence, or they say they've tried and can't get contacts on HF. Well, you often see these sort of laments. Maybe some of you or people you know or people you hear on the air have made those sorts of laments. Sometimes they make it on social media right when the DX is raging and complaining that there's no one. So, yeah, today I'll show how you can succeed on HF even with modest equipment and antennas. And most of the operating I do is with fairly low power, like around 5 watts. And it doesn't have to be all digital modes or CW either. You can be very successful with SSB. So within 30 minutes, you'll have the knowledge required to make contacts nearly every time you fire up on HF. I'm going to make that promise. All you need is to apply the 6 winning rays again and again. I won't cover equipment here. Most of you already have it, but I should mention that something fairly basic will do, provided it's hooked up to a full-sized antenna. If you don't have a full-sized antenna, you can still get contacts, not quite as consistent, but I'm happy to answer questions on that at the end. So anyway, next slide. So that's me near home, short walk from the beach, so that's all I take for portable equipment. FT817 there, and only rarely do I not make contacts with that setup because I follow the 6 winning rays to get contacts on HF. The 6 main ways, I'll go through them in summary, then I'll go into a bit more detail, as there's a bit of technique. First of all, I'll do the 6 probably in about the order that you should go whenever you decide that you want to get on the radio and make some contacts. First of all, tune across the band, see if there's anyone calling CQ, which is a general call to all amateurs, and then you reply. So that's the first thing. First thing you do, tune across the band. Secondly, you could be tuning around but be looking for a conversation in progress. If no one's calling CQ, there might still be people on the band, they might be talking, but so then you have to wait for that conversation to finish, and then you might call one of the stations involved. That's called tail ending, because you're coming in on the tail of a conversation. Another option, you could join a round table net conversation when they call for check-ins of the people wishing to join. Sometimes you succeed with that, but if you're impatient, sometimes some nets drag on and on and on. If there's not much happening after those 3, you can try and get contacts yourself by calling CQ. Fourth option, CQ is a general call to anyone who might be listening, and it's one of the distinct things about amateur radio, as opposed to any other electronic communication. Imagine if someone called CQ on Facebook or Twitter. It'd be weird, wouldn't it? Have you tried calling CQ just on YouTube, Hayden? No radio. Maybe you should try it. Maybe that should be your next video. Just call CQ and see what happens. It might be a ratings winner. You never know. Anyway, so that's a video idea for you. Anyway, and people didn't used to make random phone calls either. CQ is very much something that is tied up with amateur radio culture from the year dot. Less preferred, maybe you can, if no one replies to your CQ calls, and I'll talk about that later on, is to break into an existing conversation. It certainly works if you're impatient, but there can be problems, and I think you should do it with a bit of caution, and I'll talk about that more later. And finally, if all your methods to get contacts, random contacts, I think the highest and best way you know that your amateur radio station is working is if you can make random contacts without pre-arrangement. But if all that fails, then yeah, you could set up an appointment, or as Hams call it, a sked. That's where you arrange with someone to be on a particular frequency at a particular time via your social media. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that's a basically the summary: answering a call, tail ending an existing contact, joining a net, calling a CQ, breaking into an existing contact, or setting up a sked. Now, a lot of amateurs stumble with those three. FM and repeaters is slightly different. But anyway, responding to people's CQ calls, that's the first thing. You could see it as answering general calls you hear, and it's a good idea to answer them if you're in the shack, is one of the best ways to serve amateur radio. You can make someone's day. You do not know their circumstances if someone's randomly calling CQ. They might be, it might be their first contact on the air, they might be testing a new rig or antenna, they might be on some obscure summit, they might be in the middle of the desert. Anyway, some of the most interesting contacts you can get in amateur radio is by responding to people's CQ. So, yeah, so you might be their first contact if they've got a license. So definitely, and it's a bit like fishing in a way. You're sort of dragging your net along, tuning around the band, trying different bands. You start tuning and scanning bands are likely to be active. Depends on the time of day, depends on the equipment, antennas you've got. My book, which is called, one of my books, in fact several of my books cover it, but Australian Ham Radio Handbook covers it in quite a bit of detail, and it describes the various bands. Like in the middle of the day on 80 metres, you probably won't hear too many people calling CQ, but 20 metres at say 4, 5, 6 p.m. in the evening, there's probably 20 or 30 Europeans or whatever calling CQ. So time of day, frequency, antenna, really important. You get all those right, and that you are there when most number of people are going to be calling CQ. Good starting point, apart from 20 metres in the afternoon I mentioned, is 3.5 megahertz, 80 metres at night, or 7 or 14 megahertz during the day. Sometimes in summer 28 megahertz can be great. So yeah, when you're tuning around, you stop on every conversation to hear what it's about. If it's two people having a casual chat, maybe it's a club on air session, maybe even a callback after your broadcast, maybe it's a net for a specific purpose. Anyway, often they ask for people to check in. So if they do that, then it's so keep listening. You might want to put in your call sign. If it's someone in a national park giving points for an award, they want to make a lot of very short contacts. They want to reach their tally of 10 contacts or 44 contacts or whatever it is. So again, that's an opportunity to make contacts. So same with people, if you're in a contest, or if people are calling CQ contest, even if you don't know what the contest is, give them a call, just your call sign, and just give them a 001. If you're in doubt, they'll correct you and suggest another number if the contest rules are different. But anyway, always note the call signs you hear as well. That's very important. That tells you what conditions are like. Like, are they from a particular part of the world? And it helps if you memorise, like the American call signs start with A, K, N and W usually. Canadians VA and VE, Japan mostly J, Europeans have G for the UK, F for France, I for Italy, D for Germany, whatever. So eventually you'll memorise that and you'll hear what part of the world a band is open to at any one time. But yeah, CQ, your ears should add, even if the signal is buried in noise, very easily recognisable. CQ followed by their call sign should cause your ears to prick up. It means they're seeking contact, so make sure you get their call sign down and reply. About 2 seconds after they finish. If it's a really quick DX contact rapid fire contest, then you might jump in straight away. Otherwise, you might wait a second or two. And as to what you say when you hear the person calling CQ, well, you could just announce your call sign once or twice. Use the phonetic alphabet if signals are noisy. On the other hand, if they're CQing and style is very fast, maybe you don't use phonetic alphabet. Otherwise, they'll be might be resuming their CQ call again. If their CQ is leisurely, then your response can also be leisurely. Maybe then you use their call sign followed by yours. Different bands tend to have different operating cultures and habits. 80 metres is probably a bit slower than 20 metres with the Europeans, for instance. So,
we've got Casey Station watching tonight. Warren Nicholas.
hello, Byron.
And he just made the comment, you can certainly make someone's day by answering their CQ call from my current QTH.
Most definitely. So yeah, you never know what you might hear. Like some people operating from these more exotic locations, they might only have very limited amounts of time to be on the air. The only time you might be able to catch them might be calling CQ at a random time, and there might be no notice given. So yeah, the more you listen, the more luck, the more you scan for people calling CQ, the more luck you'll get. So if you do reply to someone, then several things can happen. Ideally, first of all, the calling station will acknowledge you, they'll give their name and a signal report. That's very common when signals are strong. That's the best case scenario. Or the calling station might resume, not having heard you, and call again in case signals improve. Some bands, signals can fade up and down. Fading can sometimes be quite quickly, so your signal might have been in a trough when you first called, so be persistent. Another possibility is you might still be hearable at their place, but someone else was louder, so they got in first. So if they do come back to that other person, then keep listening. If it's a very short contact, then they'll be off and running, calling CQ in a very short time, and you might have your chance to make it contact there. On the other hand, they might have actually heard that there was someone else as well as the station they called. So keep listening. They might realise that and come back to you and ask QRZ after they finish the contact with the first station. And of course, that's if they say QRZ, then if you reply to them and they might think there is someone there, they might not, they might have a very high noise level at their place, in which case they'll say QRZ, which means call again, so you do it clearly and slowly. Persist if necessary, and don't say anything more. It's very important. Don't say anything more until they have your call sign correct. There are some people that when they reply to a CQ call, they go on all about this stuff, even though the other station has not got your call sign correct, and it's not valid as a contact. And some people might think that they've got your call sign correct, but they haven't. Like some letters, like B and P and E, can sound very similar. So you persist. Give no more information until they've got your call sign right. Then you can move on to other stuff. Your signal report, then your name, then your location. But the basics for a contact: call sign's correct and the signal report. Overall, answering other people's CQ calls does have a fairly high success rate, especially if signals are strong and you're mostly calling people within about 2,000 or 3,000 kilometres. Single hop HF. Like we in Australia have sort of an interesting spread of distances. If you look at where people are, there's a lot of people in southeast of Australia within, say, 1,000 kilometres. If you look at people within, say, 2,000 or 3,000, you've really only got the VK6s and ZLs and North Queensland and Northern Territory. a smaller population. Then there's not very many for like 5,000-6,000. Then you've got more like 8,000, and you might have Japan, and then you've got your 15,000-16,000 kilometres like Europe and North America. So there's a lot of spaces where the band might be propagation to, but you're not getting contacts because of the lack of emitters. Now, slide 2. Now, second point, and I'll just grab a drink. The slide 2 is called tail ending, and that is a really potent method of getting contacts, and probably the most successful, especially if you're QRP. It's also something that you need to learn. It's one of the differences between making lots of contacts and making none. When I suggested before, when you turned on, had a listen, now you needed to keep tabs on certain frequencies. You're tuning, and you need to be listening actively, and especially searching for contacts about to end involving people likely to hear. Very important. About to end involving people likely to hear. Often they're quite strong signals, and your chances are high if you keep persisting or if you keep listening. If they're within about 2,000 or 3,000 kilometres, you single hop and their signals are strong, then there's a really good chance that they can hear you, even if you're running low power, even if you're a pedestrian mobile. So when you're tune past long-winded contacts, unlikely to be finishing soon, the sort of frequencies you want to keep tabs on are people making quick contacts, or where they've said they'll be going soon. They're both signs that the contacts are about to end and you can jump in. And then there's your moment. So to seize that, you call one of the stations just after they've signed. Chances are someone will hear you. It might not even be the station you've just called. Doesn't matter. Give a signal report, say your name and location, and if they respond. And you don't want to say very much at that time, as you are coming in at the end of their contact after they've signed. Maybe they really do have to go. Maybe they find the other guy a bore and they're just making excuses for going away. Anyway, give them the option of getting away quickly if they have to. But anyway, but at least give your signal report, name, location, and you put it back to them. They give their details, and then you can decide from there whether they want to stick around. So tail ending is really, really successful way of making contacts, and especially if you're running low power, probably the most successful way, because you've got a frequency where you know that people are listening. So that's better than being on a random frequency where you don't know anyone listening at all. Now the third way is to join a net or roundtable conversation. And that's something that your active listening, tuning across the band, will uncover as well. You might find groups of people on one frequency. If it's a group, it might be a net. It could be very casual, just a few friends. It could be a scheduled time. It could be radio clubs. It could be news broadcasts. It could be WISN, or it could be a DX net where there's people that get on and help people make longer distance contacts. So it's a good idea to have a listen first, see how the net runs. If you hear someone call for check-ins, then be ready to announce your call sign. Say it once, slowly and clearly. You might then be invited to say something. Now, as it's a net with lots of people, just be very brief, just your name, signal report, location, that all. You can always ask someone in the net to stay around afterwards. If you want, if you're particularly interested in having a longer contact, or just after a net's finished, you could tail end the net and call CQ. So after you've had, you heard your answer DX net on 20 metres, or maybe even you could be cheeky and 5 or 10 minutes before you could be calling CQ there, and there'll probably be people listening. Now I should point out that nets aren't everyone's favourite way of operating. Personally, I prefer one-on-one contacts. But you can make a lot of friends on nets, and they're great for testing antennas, as you can get signal reports from many people at once. So, it's an option to get contacts. Not everyone, not everyone's favourite, but definitely something to bear in mind. Now fourth slide, thanks. Well, that's me, pedestrian mobile, on the beach, and with that antenna is a magnetic loop which does 21 through to 50 megahertz, and that I've had contacts into Europe, SSB, on just on 10 metres. That was during the last solar cycle. Now, we haven't had contacts with those for quite a few years. However, in the next couple of years, with the increasing sunspot numbers, you'll be able to have contacts like that again. Next slide. Okay, calling CQ. We've already covered answering CQ calls from other people. Now, if there's not very many people around and you've got reason to think the band might be open, this is really the amateur equivalent of fishing. This is from an old amateur radio magazine, by the way. I found, I think it was for an ad for QSL cards, enlarged. So yeah, as they say, that's how you succeed. A lot like fishing, your call is your line. Sometimes it will be very quiet and you'll go for ages without bites. Other times you'll reel in contacts almost as fast as you can say 5973. And we are in an advantage here in Australia, and in VK7 might be an even more of an advantage because there's fewer of you. If you're calling CQ on, say, 20 metres, there's way fewer VK7s on air at any one time than Europeans, so you've got the numbers in your favour. There's more of them than you, so if you can call CQ, then you could have a lot of success. Now, the variety of people you'll get is quite amazing. If you call CQ, you could be talking to a hiker in the Rockies, or it could be a neighbour with antennas you've never heard on the air before, or even pedestrian mobile. With a good antenna at the right time, you could get people thousands of kilometres away replying to you. And I find this is, calling CQ and having people coming back to you, that really shows that you've got a good amateur station, you've got good operating, your antenna is right. You're not depending on other people for nets, and I think it's much more of an achievement to be making contacts by calling CQ. So key to success, several things. Got to select a good band in clear frequency. Your experience with listening, like I mentioned before, if you listen days, weeks, months, you'll notice that there are changes in the season and time of day and whatever. Activity you heard from tuning or scanning you did is a good yardstick. Depending on the band, it could be other contacts. If there are not too many people on air, there can be beacons. And there are beacons on some frequencies on 14, 14.1, 18, 21.15, 28.2. There's some other beacon frequencies, 28.2 to 28.3, and there's a segment around 28.25 to 28.27 where there's a lot of beacons in Australia, especially during the summer. You'll hear them on 10 metres. So yeah, beacons can give an indication of signal reports. Helps if you know Morse code. If not, you can get software that helps you decode that if signals are strong enough, or you could just look up frequencies. And another thing is a thing called PSK Reporter, which is a great website that you can look at where it picks up digital mode signals and plots them all over the world. Another thing called WhisperNet, which does a similar thing for weak signal propagation reporter. So you can look at where the band is open to, and that can help if you've got a beam to point in a particular direction. So as for getting success with calling CQ, punchy audio and a good signal really helps your response rate. If you're weak, others are less likely to reply, as they'll think that they'll be similarly weak. A good signal helps. Success with calling CQ is one of the best ways, in fact I think the only way, of knowing if your station is efficient or not. Now, how do you call CQ? Well, assume SSB. First of all, pick your sideband. Normally it's upper sideband for voice and digital modes, except for 1.8, 3.5 and 7 megahertz where it's lower sideband for voice. It's just tradition, but you'll get better results if you use what everyone else does. Then you select a clear frequency within your license regulation and the band plan. Now, there's a lot of things that the Foundation Manual doesn't teach you. My book, Australian Ham Radio Handbook, does. But yeah, basically part of it is not only must you be in the legal frequency range, but you also need to be a popular part of the band. And that depends, especially where you're trying to get contacts from. It needs to be part of the band that people will tune across, but not one that's too close to other people's frequency. That's because no one wins if your signal is under someone else's. Even a signal that appears weak to you might be very strong, might be wide, it might even be splattering, so you don't want to be only like 2 kilohertz away from someone else. If you can be 3, preferably 4 or 5 kilohertz, that's better. Even more if you can. So yeah, it really helps your chances if you can put yourself in the clear. So you should listen a bit, then you ask if the frequency is in use, maybe a couple of times. Again, no one wins if other people are on frequency. And there are certain bands where you might not hear anything but at someone else, at a location where others might be listening, they can hear both and cause interference. Now, some people talk about, the reason why some people might not hear you is particularly on the higher HF bands is there can be a skip zone where your signal might skip over someone in the middle, but that person in the middle can hear people. Some people that you can, some people that you can't. So it's a bit of a gamble. Now, a lot of newcomers to amateur radio ask, are our amateur bands channelized? They are. You could argue that they are on 2 meters. People normally operate on multiples of 25 kilohertz or 12.5 or whatever. And neither HF bands though are not. Neither are there formal calling frequencies. A lot of people wonder, are there calling frequencies? In fact, if you look at the WIA broadcast scripts, there's a bit about calling frequencies, and people read that and they think it's calling frequencies, but it's not. It's after a thing about scouts and amateur radio, and it lists all these calling frequencies, including some on 52 megahertz that would not have ever been used for that purpose by scouts or anyone else. It's a part of the broadcast that's confusing and should be got rid of, yet it's been in the broadcast script for years after years and years, and it's complete rubbish. Anyway, so yeah, it can confuse newcomers. No, there are no calling frequencies on HF, and it's not quite. Whereas CB, there's sort of informal channel 35 lower sideband where you'll get all the activity, and if you go on my YouTube channel, you'll hear some summer activity mostly from channel 35 of all the people there from around Australia when the conditions are great. But yeah, HF ham radio, very different to 27 meg or even 2 meters FM. On 2 meters FM there's calling frequencies like 146.5 and 144.1, but HF, basically no calling frequencies. The main exception, 10 meters FM, 29.6. It's sort of a bit of a calling frequency. Then there's 28.49 that some people say is it a calling frequency or not. It's sort of an informal thing. You probably leave your 10 meter rig on there if you're doing stuff around the shack, and it's not in the WIA band plan as a calling frequency, but some people say it's an informal calling frequency. So basically calling frequencies are probably okay if the band is dead and there's hardly anyone else on it. Probably better referred to as centre of activity. So as soon as there's a bit of an opening, there's people on, you probably want to get away from the calling frequencies and call CQ on frequencies spread across the band rather than all stick on the one frequency, especially if you know that things are wide open. But the great thing is not having channels means that you can operate on any legal frequency with you in your amateur allocation. Despite that, a lot of HF hams set up on an even multiple of 5 kilohertz, even though maybe they like to look at it on the dial, it's a round number, but there's really no need to. In fact, you might get less on-frequency interference if most people are going to be on multiples of 5 kilohertz. The probability of you being in the clear is higher if I think you travel the road less travelled and pick a frequency ending in 2, 3, 7 or 8 kilohertz, because if you assume that there are people that you are on other people's frequency but you might not be able to hear them, they'll more likely be on a multiple of 5 kilohertz. If you have an obscure frequency in between, then you're probably more likely on average to be in the clear. So just something I'd suggest. But the most important thing is on SSB, you're 3 or 4 kilohertz away from another signal. So, so your sideband is right. You've got a clear frequency. Now time to make your call. So it might just be CQ, 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 VK3YE, VK3YE, VK3 Yankee Echo, CQ, CQ, CQ. Or you might want a bit of energy in your voice. Like that was a bit of a drone. So maybe it should be like CQ, 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 CQ. You know, maybe if you're a bit more enthusiastic, you come over a bit stronger in the air, you might sound a bit more less boring to talk to. Maybe that will get the multitudes in. So maybe a bit of enthusiasm when you're calling CQ. You also probably maybe the speech processor. CQ, 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 CQ. So it really, gets through all the needles kicking through. You don't want to overmodulate or overprocess, but yeah, you do want a audio shape and characteristics that penetrate signals very well, especially in if you're trying to work DX, especially if you're low power. That's where transmitter audio can come in. With my FT817, that has a particularly thin audio characteristic, and it does cut across DX quite well. That's because of a modification I did to the microphone, and I I did a couple of videos how I demonstrated it. I just replaced the standard insert with an electrode insert, and I think, and anyway, the standard microphone with the FT817 isn't the best for getting your signal through if signals are weak. So there are microphones or modules or mods you can do, so look that up if you have an FT817. But yeah, you want your signal to be to be punchy audio so people can hear you. Now, another thing is when you're calling CQ, listen a reasonable amount of time for replies before resuming calling. Maybe a bit longer than that, maybe about 15 or 20 seconds after long calls, maybe 5 seconds during busy contests. Again, depends on the pace of operating. Don't worry if you don't get a response after your first, second or third call. After all, it's a pretty big ask for someone to be actually tuning across at the precise moment that you are calling CQ. At best they might have heard CQ and not got your call sign. People need time to find you. They might be looking at the spectrum display on their transceiver, or for them to be cranking the knob and to find you. And of course we've got so many HF bands now. It can take ages for people to tune all the bands. So yeah, allow a bit of time, and remember the time it took for you to tune the whole HF band. So persist for 10 or 15 minutes minimum, preferably more. Again, it's like fishing. So many times you're almost about to pack up and think there's no one there, and then you get a great call from someone, and you end up talking to someone, and then someone else joins in, and before you know it, you've got 5 or 6 contacts in the log. So that can happen. So definitely be persistent. The better HF transceivers come with a voice keyer to call automatically, but if yours doesn't, a computer or mobile phone app connected to your transceiver could do the job. So that's enough on calling CQ. No matter what mode, it's immensely satisfying. It's basically what amateur radio is all about. If you succeed in it, it reflects well on your station operating. Activity begets activity, so make sure you make it a habit to answer or make a CQ call every time you switch on your gear. So next slide. So yeah, as I mentioned, a lot like fishing, and that includes the mystery of getting a catch like that. So it's part of the distinctive things about amateur radio. The fifth way is, if everything else I've suggested hasn't succeeded, you could try breaking into an existing conversation. If there's no one calling CQ, no contacts about to finish, no replies to calls you've put out, I think you should do it with discretion. Breaking in is common and accepted for contacts on VHF repeaters. HF, possibly a little less so. If the context is in depth and you can't add to the discussion topic, and especially if you can't hear anyone in a group, then it's perhaps better holding off. Every ham though has moments when the urge to break in is irresistible. Like they might be just put up a new antenna, got a new rig and are after signal reports, and a few people would begrudge someone breaking in for that. But the timing in that is very, very critical. The golden rule is never talk over someone else, and never say the word break or break unless it's a matter of urgency. Instead, the correct procedure is to insert your call sign once after the station finishes and before the next transmits. Now, this might be a bit controversial. People watching the video might differ, but no, it's just put in your call sign once and announced well. Anyway, with any luck after that, they'll hear you and call you in. With less luck, they won't hear you, but keep listening anyway, because not infrequently, a third person who did hear you later breaks in and a contact may be possible. If you do break in, keep your transmissions short as you're the guest into an established contact, at least for the first few. So that's fifth breaking in. Number 6, last point, arranging a contact. Last way of getting a contact is to arrange it beforehand. Examples, you have skeds. Amateurs, some amateurs have daily or weekly skeds. They can talk and check they're still alive and whatever. And when they come up on a particular time or frequency, maybe out of habit or if their commutes coincide. Those sorts of skeds are great times to tail end contact after they finish. And if you don't make it one day, they might be on the next day, and it might be very regular patterns. So you might find yourself invited in, and that can be a good way of getting contacts. Then there's people transmitting from a sought-after country or national park. Tasmania is its own island for IOTA, so maybe some of the islands offshore might be even more distinctive, or mountain summit. Well, people often advise expected frequencies and times beforehand. Activating a park or a summit, if you weren't operating from a park, if you were to go out randomly during a weekday, it might be a hard time to get more than a few contacts on 40 metres during the day. As soon as it's a park or a summit or something, then you might have 10 or 20 or more contacts. So being involved in something like VKFF, the parks or summits of the air, that can really multiply your chance of getting contacts. And there are parks and peaks is a thing that you can go on, and you can announce your activity, and people will be listening for you. So that's a way of arranging a contact to increase your chances. You could use email or social media. Overall, pre-arranged contacts are, if it's your first contact, HF contact, you might want to do it with someone who helped you get in. So the overall pre-arranged contacts are perhaps less challenging than random contacts, but they're fully legitimate and common, so don't shy away from them, especially if you're planning a special activity. So yeah, next slide, thanks. Next slide. So basically, I've outlined 6 winning ways to get HF contacts. Learn what they are. There'll be a video later on if you want to hear more. Practice and persist. You'll work more on HF than what you ever thought possible. A couple of some books here that could be handy, that sort of thing. A lot of operating stuff like what I've talked about tonight, but in more detail in the Australian Ham Radio Handbook, and it's great that people here have that. Visit my website, vk3ye.com. You can get it as an ebook via Amazon. If there's only one book you get, especially if you're starting in amateur radio, get this one. If you're more interested in low power amateur radio, it's under 5 watts, minimum QRP is the one. It's sold thousands and thousands all around the world. You can read the reviews on Amazon. And then more into antennas, there's 2 antenna books there. So they're $7 on Amazon, and they can, so yeah, that's some, there's also, next slide. This is something we started only about a month or 2 ago. It's been so successful, I think we've depleted almost all their stocks of squid poles. When I last looked, there are poles of up to because this is actually a fishing shop. They sell these fishing and outdoor stuff. But as far as the squid poles go, it's the amateurs, I think, that buy them more than the fishing people. Anyway, when I last looked, you can get poles of 6 metres, 5 metres, 3 metres. We're still in stock. And a 6 metre pole, that's not a bad length, because that can be a full wavelength. In fact, 6 metres can be a little bit more than a quarter wavelength on 20 metres. You could make a ground plane out of that, have just as a vertical thing. And a 6 metre pole would be very light. You could just support maybe a lightweight link dipole on 40 metres. I'd prefer slightly higher if you can, but the shorter the pole, the lighter it is, which could be an important consideration if you are doing summits of the air. Even 3 metre poles, well, that's a half wavelength on 6 metres and a quarter wavelength on 10 metres, so that could be useful. You could just use some insulated wire, and that could be the basis of a portable vertical. For that, you could even use it to support a low dipole. So haverford.com.au, put in VK3YE as a discount code, and that's a offer for squid poles. Next slide. So anyway, questions and answers.
Got a few from the watching audience. From Ollie, VK7NFI, favourite QRP antenna and favourite QRP band?
Okay. Overall, in terms of success in getting contacts for QRP band, I would say 40 metres. It seems to be open to somewhere at almost all times of the day and night. Although it can vary, like for a few weeks over summer, Christmas, New Year, 10 metres can really come into its own. With the rising solar cycle, out of the foundation bands that you've got, 15 metres will start to come good, and then 10 metres. 80 metres is handy if you are mostly get to operate at night. That can be good for contacts into within VK7 and VK3, VK5. There's a lot of it depends on if you're more into international contacts or more local chit chat. Overall, I'd say 40 metres. As for an antenna, I most commonly use a end-fed half wavelength, which is quite efficient on 7 megahertz, being a 20 metre long piece of wire. It also needs only a single support, like a squid pole, but there's antennas for different purposes, like for 20 metre DX, if you're in a marshy or salty area. There's one called it's probably not so well known, called the bobtail curtain, and that is quite good for low angle DX if you're firing your signal in a particular direction. Some antennas are good for shorter distance high angle, others good for longer distance low angle radiation. Some antennas are directional, some are not. Really comes down to what sort of distances, what sort of frequencies, and how much space you've got. A lot of information on antennas, including some good pics on my website, vk3ye.com, and also in the antenna books I mentioned before. So I hope that answers your question.
And another question from Warren down south. Which are the more popular DX cluster websites?
DX cluster websites. Personally, I don't use DX clusters, but if does anyone else in the room use them? And Aidan?
DX Summit,
DX Summit.
probably.
Yeah. DX.
PSK Reporters, probably.
Yeah. Like PSK Reporter, basically takes in, all different modes, like FT8. You can, I think it does whisper and other modes, and it draws maps of where signals are and signal levels, and you can look at different times of day and bands and. Like personally, I don't use DX clusters and whatever, but yeah, if you're serious into DX, if you're into DX tallies where you have to work a number of these artificial countries or entities, then yeah, a DX cluster can be valuable if you want to know if the if the DX is on. The problem is that half the world then knows, so you may have a lot of competition in getting through. So it's probably better to find the DX before they get on the cluster. Any more questions? Yeah.
I just make a comment that these days a lot of people are running fairly recent radios that have got spectrum scopes, and that they can actually see a signal now,
Yes.
whereas in the old days they had to twiddle it and
Yeah.
not find you, so you can actually see, they can see your signal as long as you've got a half decent signal.
Yes, yeah, that can
Speed the
definitely
machine
help.
up a bit.
Yeah. So even if you're not tuning around, if you've got a display and you've got all these spikes, then yeah, that can definitely be an advantage. Hey?
What's more important, a good antenna or a good radio? To
I'd
make
s-
HF
I'd
contact?
say none of those. It's a good operator who persists. Because if you're not, even you might have the best radio, you might have the best antenna, but if you're not on, then you won't make any contact. So
Peter, based on your comment about using end feeds, how do you go for grounds, and I'm not thinking about standing in the water like you do if the water's too cold. So what's a viable alternative that's not 10 miles away?
well, good question. Have a look. Well, simplest you could just have a few radials. Some people suggest quarter wavelength. However, you can go quite a bit smaller and have a tuned counterpoise. His G4AKC, he sort of calls it pedestrian bicycle mobile, but it's more portable, where he gets to his location in the bicycle and he has a counterpoise. It might just be a short bit of metal or wire, and then it's got a tuner. I think it's just a series tuning capacitor and coil, and you set that up. You have a ground current meter. That's very easy to make. You just need a meter movement diode, and I think there's a toroid that you pass a wire through, something like that. You tune for maximum ground current, and that couples into the ground beneath you, preferably salt water or salty sand. You have to be really close to the water's edge, preferably I think within a third of a wavelength. Now, having said that, you can get away with almost nothing. In fact, with 20 metres of wire and on 7 megahertz, with a quarter wavelength of wire, like 20 metres of wire on 3.5 megahertz, it's not really going to be a very good antenna without much of a ground. But you can get away with near half wavelength of wire, high impedance. Now, if you're running high power, you may have an issue with RF floating around. It might be a good idea to have a small counterpoise. Les Moxon talks about that in his books of it might be as short as 0.05 of a wavelength, maybe only a metre or two of wire as a counterpoise, and you've got a half wavelength. If you've got a half wavelength antenna, but that will present a very high impedance, so you will need an antenna coupler, or I think it's 49 to 1 or whatever. I generally use an L-match antenna coupler. Now there are some different views depending on antennas. Like there's I'm just trying to think of the book, Low Band DXing by ON4UN. He talks about the importance of ground, and of course you can talk about buried radials versus elevated radials, and there's do the radials have to be all equal length? Do they have to be exactly quarter wavelength? And there's a large number of shorter radials versus a smaller number of longer radials. There's all these different things, but overall you can still get results with a half wavelength of wire and a short counterpoise, or failing that, but if you are limited with space, then tuned counterpoise is something that you might want to look into. And details are on G4AKC's website. Anyway, you'll find, if you look under G4AKC on QRZ, there'll be a link to a website, because I should mention that we did some milliwatt tests. This was about a couple of months ago when the weather was still good. Went out portable, and we're on 20 metres, and we went down to see how low, and we could easily hear each other with 500 milliwatts on 20 metres from the UK to Melbourne. I was using, I think, my bobtail curtain in the swamp, G4AKC was using his vertical by the seaside, and it was long path. The caudal hop was probably just right, and I think he might have even gone down to 100 milliwatts. So I might have still heard him. But anyway, you could certainly have milliwatt SSB communication, long path on 20 metres in the late afternoon between the UK and Australia, if you're both at good locations, even with quite modest antennas.
Any other questions for Peter? Can we show our appreciation? Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Grab a coffee.